Mitchell, who is a strong and great supporter, Ivor Browne and Dan Neville, without whom there would literally be no conference. An elderly GP once consulted Dr. Viktor Frankl, the famous Viennese psychiatrist and philosopher. The reason is that he could not overcome the loss of his wife, who had died 2 years before and whom he had loved above all else. How could Frankl help him? What should he say? Well, Frankl confronted him with a question. What would have happened, doctor, if you had died first and your wife would have had to survive you? Oh, he said, for her this would have been terrible. How she would have suffered. Whereupon Frankl replied, you see, doctor, such a suffering has been spared her, and it was you who have spared her the suffering. To be sure at the price now that you have to survive and mourn her. He said no word, but shook Dr. Frankl's hand, and Camby left the office. In some ways, suffering ceases to be suffering at the moment it finds a meaning, such as the meaning of a sacrifice. This man's despair was no disease. Frankl could not change his fate. He couldn't revive his wife. But he did succeed in changing his attitude towards his unalterable fate, inasmuch as the man could now see a meaning in his awful suffering. This is logotherapy. It is healing through meaning. It is any meaning-centered intervention leading to attitudinal change. So I'm delighted to address you this morning on this first ever public lecture on suicide and logotherapy in Ireland. It was a subject very close to Dr. Frankl's heart. And my aim in this paper is just to offer some answers to the questions posed by suicide from a logotherapeutic perspective. My interest isn't just professional. I lost 2 close friends through suicide, and I would say that nearly 2/3 of my patients have experienced suicide through their friends or family members having taken their own lives. In The Myth of Sisyphus, the French philosopher Albert Camus observes, and I quote, there is but one truly philosophical problem, and that is suicide. Judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental questions of philosophy. All the rest comes afterwards. These are just games. End of quote. Emile Durkheim penned the first major work on suicide from a sociological point of view. However, in the medicalization of the discourse surrounding suicide, it is easy to forget that above all else, it is a philosophical problem because it is an existential and ethical issue. The Swiss psychologist C.G. Jung, in his 1940 publication, Psychology and a Philosophy of Life, wrote, I can hardly draw a veil over the fact that we psychotherapists ought really to be philosophers or philosophic doctors, or rather that we already are so. End of quote. Frankl similarly felt that patients brought philosophical questions into the clinic. On the question of suicide, Jung had written, quote, the secret is that only that which can destroy itself is truly alive. End of quote. Freud, for his part, in an early paper from 1915, Thoughts on War and Death, noted, quote, if you would endure life, be prepared for death. Suicide arises in life. Indeed, it is the pressing and most alarming question in life. How can we prepare for it? How should we understand it? Why does one do it? Why does one not? Some suicides are successful, all are secretive. We cannot guess the sufferings of a suicidal soul. The question arises, can one be sane and suicidal? Why not? Should we condemn or condone it, prevent or permit it? Witness G.K. Chesterton's harsh, unpsychological tone, but a view still held by some in the Christian churches, quote, not only is suicide a sin, it is the sin. It is the ultimate and absolute evil, the refusal to take an interest in existence, the refusal to take an oath of loyalty to life. The man who kills a man kills a man. The man who kills himself kills all men. Insofar as he is concerned, he wipes out the world. His act is worse than any rape or dynamite outrage, for it destroys all buildings, it insults all women. The thief is satisfied with diamonds, but the suicide is not. That is his crime. He cannot be bribed even by the blazing stones of the celestial city. The thief compliments the things he steals, if not the owner of them, but the suicide insults everything on earth by not stealing it. He defiles every flower by refusing to live for its sake. The There is not a tiny creature in the cosmos at whom his death is not a sneer. When a man hangs himself on a tree, the leaves might fall off in anger and the birds fly away in fury, for each has received a personal affront. Of course, there may be pathetic emotional excuses for the act. There often are for rape, and there almost always are for dynamite. But if it comes to clear ideas and the intelligent meaning of things, then there is much more rational and philosophic truth in the burial at the crossroads or the stake driven through the body. There is a meaning in burying the suicide apart. The man's crime is different from other crimes, for it makes even crimes impossible. End of quote. The view that suicide is a sin and criminal is upheld by three great traditions upon which Western justice stands: Roman law, church law, and English law. Their view is, I may not mine own executioner be. Sane, in inverted commas, suicides are sometimes disguised as accidents for this reason. For the church, suicide is homicide. Thou shalt not kill commands us to maintain ourselves in being. Self-murder is seen as a transgression of the divine law. Is talk that centres predominantly on suicide prevention a form of suicide prejudice, a disguised dread of death? Surely we need to talk about death, and therefore of life, in the debate. Schopenhauer, the great German philosopher, opined that life was a dance into the arms of death, and Heidegger pictured man as a being towards death. Freud wrote, the aim of all life is death, when he introduced his notion of a death drive. But we need to go back to Plato to encounter the view that philosophy, understood as a therapy for the soul and upon which logotherapy builds, is a preparation for death. Judas was the first modern man who went out and hanged himself for his act of betrayal of the Son of Man. What is the meaning of a suicide? The mind reaches for reasons. We quest meanings, answers, notes left telling us why, providing us with explanations. The answer is often unconscious. Perhaps the one who stares death in the face but refuses it understands it better than the one who commits it. If theology is devoted to death, philosophy comes nearest to formulating the analyst's experiences of death in the consulting room. Philosophy, conceived of platonically, is the pursuit of death. Plato tells us that philosophers make dying their profession. But some, like Socrates and Seneca, see death from the point of view of life. They see the world through the sockets of a skull. The moment I am born, I am able to die, so it's important to live each day as if it were the last, but also as if it were the first. Sufficient unto the day, the evil thereof. In a book, Suicide and the Soul, James Hillman, a Jungian and philosopher, sums up the logic thus, quote, if only the living can die, only the dying are really alive. So to philosophize is to learn how to die. Death is present, it is the purpose of life. Death may happen at any moment, therefore at every moment. All death is suicide, to the extent that one drinks too much or drives too fast or smokes too often. Doctors and politicians should do well to consider philosophy and logotherapy as the first step in their struggle with the suicide problem. Thoughts of suicide confront one almost as a fantasy. Hillman writes, until we can say no to life, we have not really said yes to it. Some choose death because they are afraid of life, others choose life because they're afraid of death. Some are, in Keats's poetic phrase, half in love with easeful death. Suicide is the attempt to move from one realm to another. There is an attempt, it seems to me, at transformation rather than just termination. Interestingly, where collective rather than just individual death is lived with, for example during wars, suicide is seldom. Suicide by car crash or sleeping tablets, by hanging or jumping, are different kinds of death. The person is free to decide the method, the time, to plan in advance and commit the act in isolation. We are not responsible for another man's death or for his life. Each person's death and life are his own. We are responsible, though, for our involvements in them. Suicide shocks and startles because it compels us to confront our own shadow selves and dread of death. Suicide is the paradigm of our stubborn independence from everybody else. As such,